This began in the suffocating heat of late 2019, just before the world went crazy. My best friend, Marcus, and I possessed a morbid fascination for the architectural corpses of America, places left to rot by time and indifference. We weren't vandals or looters. We were witnesses, documenting the slow decay of forgotten structures in the Pacific Northwest. We sought the places the maps ignored, driven by an adrenaline addiction that felt increasingly like a death wish. Our latest obsession was a fire lookout tower, rumored to exist deep within the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, a structure that technically shouldn't have been standing. Marcus had scraped the coordinates from a deleted thread on a niche urban exploration forum, buried under layers of digital noise. The original poster, a user named Watcher_0, had been hostile when I privately messaged him, warning us that the location was sour and demanding we never share the coordinates. His reluctance didn't deter us, it acted like blood in the water. We plugged the numbers into our GPS, loaded our packs with enough gear for a 2-day siege, and drove 6 hours into the Oregon wilderness, oblivious to the fact that we were hunting a trap. The forest didn't welcome us. It tolerated us like a biological host tolerates a parasite. The GPS indicated we were 5 miles from the nearest paved road, deep within the tangled spine of the Cascades, but the silence felt artificially imposed, heavy enough to pop your ears. Marcus, usually the loud one, had stopped cracking jokes a mile back. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dense wall of Douglas firs as if he expected the trees to rearrange themselves the moment we passed. The air grew colder, carrying a metallic tang that tasted like ozone and stale copper, completely at odds with the damp earth smells. I checked my compass twice, but the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle north, a mechanical failure that sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through my gut. We were walking into a blind spot on the map, a place where the rules of geography felt suspended. "You feel that?" Marcus whispered, the sound too loud in the quiet, like the air pressure just dropped. I nodded, unable to speak, gripping my pack straps until my knuckles turned white. We pushed forward, crossing a threshold we couldn't see, but definitely felt. We didn't see the tower until we were practically underneath its looming shadow. The forest ended abruptly, severed by a perfectly circular clearing of dead, yellowed grass. In the center stood the lookout, not the majestic structure we envisioned, but a squat, leaning cabin perched on a decaying foundation of granite and rot. It looked like a tumor growing out of the hilltop. The wood siding was bleached to the color of bone, splintered and warping outward as if something inside had tried to push its way out. The windows were opaque, coated in decades of grime and a thick, greasy residue that caught the weak sunlight. The entire structure listed 5 degrees to the west, giving me an intense sense of vertigo just looking at it. Marcus, seemingly shaking off his earlier dread, rushed forward, his camera raised. I hesitated at the tree line, a primal instinct screaming that this was a predator's mouth, not a shelter. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin's siding, creating a harmonic tone that sounded disturbingly like a human moan. I forced my legs to move, stepping into the dead circle, unaware that the forest had just closed behind us. The door didn't have a handle, just a hole where the lock used to be, black and inviting. Marcus pushed it open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest, a sound that echoed across the valley like a gunshot. We stepped into the gloom, immediately assaulted by the smell of mildew, rat droppings, and something sweeter, like fermenting fruit. The interior was a time capsule of abandonment. A rusted cot frame sat in the corner, surrounded by cans of beer that had expired in the 80s. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light cutting through the grime, swirling in unnatural patterns. But it was the far wall that stopped my heart. Taped to the peeling plaster, perfectly centered, was a single sheet of crisp white printer paper. It looked brand new, completely untouched by the filth surrounding it. In bold black ink, 3 words were printed: "Hope you're happy." Marcus laughed nervously, dismissing it as a prank by the forum user, but his laugh died when he touched the paper. It was warm. The adhesive was fresh. Someone had been here hours ago, maybe minutes, waiting for us to arrive. Night fell with the suddenness of a guillotine blade. We secured the door with a heavy bacterial latch we found on the floor and rolled out our sleeping bags. The earlier excitement replaced by a suffocating paranoia. We didn't speak. The silence of the cabin was heavier than the silence outside. It felt attentive, listening to our breathing. I heated water on my portable stove, the hiss of the gas burner the only familiar sound in a world gone wrong. We ate mechanically, eyes darting to the black rectangles of the windows, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. The air in the room grew frigid, despite the insulation. I could feel Marcus vibrating with tension beside me. He said, "I don't think we're alone out here. I keep hearing breathing, not yours." I told him it was the wind lying to him and myself. I had heard it too, a wet, raspy inhalation coming from the corners of the room, drifting just below the threshold of clear hearing. We retreated into our bags, feigning sleep, while the cabin settled around us, groaning like a dying ship adrift in a dark ocean. I woke to a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing on my eyes. The silence was broken by a rhythmic, dull sound. Thud, drag, thud, drag, moving directly above us on the roof. I froze, my lungs seizing, listening to the heavy weight traverse the rotting shingles. It was too heavy for a raccoon, too deliberate for a branch. It stopped directly over my head. Then the silence returned, worse than before. I turned to wake Marcus, but his sleeping bag was flat, empty. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. I sat up, fumbling for my headlamp, the beam cutting through the dust. The door was unlatched, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Marcus," I hissed. Nothing. I scrambled to my feet, terrified he had gone out to pee and encountered whatever was on the roof. Suddenly, the door swung wide open, and Marcus stepped in, pale and trembling. He said, "I heard you calling me." He said, "From outside." I stared at him, blood draining from my face. "I've been asleep, Marcus. I didn't call you." The realization hit us both simultaneously. Something had lured him out into the dark. The sun brought no relief, only a gray, washed-out light that made the forest look sickly. The trees seemed closer to the cabin than they had been yesterday, the circle of dead grass shrinking. We spent the day exploring the perimeter, desperate to find a logical explanation for the night's events, but found nothing. No footprints, no animal tracks, just the undisturbed decay of the mountain. The feeling of being watched was a physical sensation now, a prickling on the back of the neck that never ceased. We tried to leave early, but a dense, unnatural fog rolled in around noon, reducing visibility to zero. We were trapped. Around dusk, as we prepared for another night in the hellbox, Marcus froze near the window. "Don't move," he breathed. I followed his gaze. Standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless in the mist, was a figure. A man, or something wearing the shape of a man, dressed in ragged gray flannel. He held a rifle, but he wasn't holding it like a weapon. He held it like a foreign object. He was staring directly at the tower. I grabbed my binoculars, my hands shaking so violently I could barely focus the lenses. When the image clarified, I gasped. The man's face was slack, devoid of any muscle tension, his mouth hanging slightly open. But his eyes were wrong. They were wide, unblinking, and completely black, as if the pupils had swallowed the irises. He wasn't looking at us, he was looking through us. "Hey!" I shouted, the sound pathetic against the vastness of the woods. "What do you want?" The figure didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply began to walk backward, retreating into the tree line without moving his legs in a natural stride, as if he were being pulled by a wire. "He's not real," Marcus muttered, clutching his knife. "That didn't look real, Elias." We barricaded the door with the old cot and the rusted stove, piling everything we could find against the entrance. The dread transformed into terror. We knew, with absolute certainty, that the man wasn't a hunter. He was a scout, and he had seen exactly where we were hiding. Hours bled into a torture of waiting. We sat back to back in the center of the room, the only light coming from the dying batteries of our lantern. Then it started, a soft, polite knock on the door. Rap, rap, rap. We stopped breathing. Silence. Then a knock on the west wall. Rap, rap, rap. Then the east wall, then the floorboards beneath us. It wasn't one person, it was everywhere. The knocking grew louder, losing its politeness, turning into violent, heavy slams that shook the entire structure. Dust rained down from the ceiling. "Let us in," a voice whispered, not from outside, but from the corner of the room. It sounded exactly like my voice. "Let us in, Marcus!" Marcus screamed, swinging his knife at the empty air. The banging reached a crescendo, a deafening cacophony of fists against wood, and then instantaneously, it stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the noise. We didn't move until dawn. We didn't sleep. We simply waited for the door to burst open, praying for the sun to save us from the mimicry outside. We abandoned our gear. As soon as the gray light of dawn touched the trees, we unbarred the door and sprinted. We didn't look back at the tower. We didn't look for the man in the flannel. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, tearing through the underbrush, guided only by the panic-induced need to escape. The woods felt malicious, snagging our clothes and tripping our feet, but we made it to the car. I drove at 90 miles an hour until we hit the interstate. When I finally got a signal, I checked the form to message Watcher Zero, to scream at him, to ask what the hell lived on that ridge. The thread was gone. His user profile was deleted. I searched the Wayback Machine, archives, caches, nothing. As if the location never existed. But sometimes, late at night, I get a text from an unknown number. It's never words, just a recording of 3 polite knocks, followed by the sound of my own voice whispering, "Hope you're happy." Marcus doesn't answer his phone anymore. I think he knows they followed us home. I haven't spoken about this to anyone, not even my therapist, because saying it out loud makes it real. 5 years ago, I was drifting through the American interior, living out of a beat-up Tacoma with my dog, Barnaby. Barnaby was a blue heeler mix, a rescue with eyes that saw too much and a protective streak a mile wide. We were inseparable, two ghosts haunting the back roads of Montana. I was looking for solitude, aiming to escape the noise of a life that had imploded back east. I found a spot on the map in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, a decommissioned fire lookout that wasn't listed on any tourist brochures. It was marked only as Structure 9, accessible by a forgotten fire break trail that wound up a jagged spine of granite. I parked the truck at the trailhead, loaded my pack, and we began the hike under a sky that was bruising purple and black. The air was heavy, static charged, the kind of atmosphere that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I ignored the signs. I just wanted the view. We were halfway up the ridge when the weather turned violent. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in minutes, and the wind began to scream through the canyons, carrying the scent of ozone and crushed pine needles. A wall of black clouds crested the mountain peak, rolling toward us like a tidal wave of ink. "Come on, boy," I yelled over the wind, dragging Barnaby by his harness. We scrambled up the last steep incline, slipping on loose shale until the tower loomed above us. It was a skeletal thing, steel legs rusting into the rock, the cabin perched 60 feet in the air. It looked precarious, swaying slightly in the gale. We climbed the metal stairs, the grating clanging under our boots, and I kicked the trap door open. We tumbled inside just as the sky tore open. Hail the size of marbles hammered the roof, deafening and relentless. I collapsed on the dusty floor, pulling Barnaby close. He was shivering, but not from the cold. He was growling low in his throat, staring at the floorboards. The cabin was a hollow shell, stripped of everything but a rusted wood stove and a bolted-down table. The windows were plexiglass, yellowed and scratched, turning the storm outside into a blur of violence. I set up my bedroll in the corner, away from the drafty trapdoor. The storm raged for hours, a chaotic symphony of thunder and wind that shook the tower's foundations. I tried to read, but the swaying of the structure made me nauseous. Barnaby refused to settle. He paced the small perimeter, his claws clicking nervously on the wood, whining at the trapdoor. "It's just thunder, buddy," I soothed, reaching out to pet him. He flinched away from my hand, his hackles raised. He wasn't looking at the windows. He was staring intently at the floor, listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, in a lull between thunderclaps, I heard it. A deep, rhythmic grinding sound. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from beneath the earth, vibrating up through the steel legs of the tower. It sounded like heavy machinery operating deep underground, metal shearing against stone. Grind, clank, grind, clank. I pressed my ear to the floorboards, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. This tower wasn't just a lookout, it was connected to something below. I tried to rationalize it, stress on the metal supports, shifting rocks, but the rhythm was too mechanical, too purposeful. Barnaby let out a sharp bark, then backed into the corner, baring his teeth. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing to see. Just the empty room and the storm outside. I checked my watch, midnight. The grinding stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving a ringing silence that was somehow worse. Exhaustion eventually overtook fear. I curled around the dog, my hand resting on his flank, feeling his rapid heartbeat. I drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of tunnels spiraling down into the earth, filled with things that had no eyes. I woke with a gasp. The storm had vanished. The silence was absolute. No wind, no rain, no crickets. It was a vacuum. I reached for my dog, but the space beside me was empty. "Barnaby," I whispered. I swept the flashlight beam across the room. He was standing by the trapdoor, his nose pressed to the crack, trembling so violently his teeth chattered. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in an animal. He needed to get out, now. I pulled on my boots, dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't want to open that door. I didn't want to see what was outside in that unnatural silence, but the dog was frantic. I unlatched the trap door and he bolted down the stairs, slipping on the metal. "Wait," I hissed, scrambling after him. The air outside was freezing, dead still. The moon was hidden, the world painted in shades of charcoal and black. Barnaby didn't run into the woods to relieve himself. He ran straight to the base of the tower and stopped, staring at a patch of overgrown brush near the concrete footings. I reached the ground, swinging the beam of my light to find him. He was frozen, statue still, pointing. I moved beside him, aiming the light where he was looking. Hidden beneath the thicket of briars was a heavy steel bulkhead, set horizontally into the rock, a cellar door. It was slightly ajar. A black crescent of open space gaped at us, exhaling a draft of air that smelled of rot and ancient stale earth. My breath hitched. This wasn't on any map. Why would a fire tower need a storm cellar? And then I saw the detail that stopped my heart. On the wet steel of the door, glistening in my light, were handprints. Muddy, smeared handprints. They weren't pushing the door closed. They were on the outside, gripping the edge as if someone had just pulled it open from within. I took a step closer, compelled by a suicidal curiosity. I shined the light into the crack. Concrete steps descended into absolute blackness. And there, on the top step, was a puddle of water, rippling. Something had just stepped down or stepped up. Barnaby let out a sound I will never forget, a low, mournful howl that cut off into a whimper. He backed away, tail tucked so far between his legs he could barely walk. Then, from the darkness of the pit, I heard a sound. A wet, sticky slap, like a barefoot hitting concrete. Then another. Slap, slap, rising, coming up the stairs. The smell hit me then, an overpowering stench of ammonia and unwashed flesh. My survival instinct finally overrode my shock. I didn't wait to see the face. I didn't call out. I grabbed Barnaby by the collar and I ran. We sprinted down the fire break trail, sliding in the mud, risking broken ankles in the dark. I didn't use my light. I didn't want to be a target. I could hear nothing behind us but the pounding of my own blood, but I felt it, a pressure on my back, a gaze so intense it felt like heat. Barnaby was pulling me, choking himself on his collar, desperate to put distance between us. We ran for what felt like hours until my chest burned and my legs turned to jelly. When we finally reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them in the mud, sobbing in frustration. I snatched them up, unlocked the door, and threw the dog inside. As I slammed the door and locked it, I looked back up the ridge. A single light had flickered on in the tower cabin. Not a flashlight, a lantern. Someone was up there, watching us leave. I drove until the gaslight screamed, putting 200 miles between us and that mountain before sunrise. I called the Forest Service the next day from a payphone in Idaho. I tried to sound rational, asking about the maintenance cellar under the tower. The ranger on the line went quiet. "There is no cellar at Structure 9. He said his voice was flat. "That tower is built on solid granite. It's a stilt foundation." I insisted. I told him about the door, the smell. He interrupted me. "Sir, stay out of that area. We have had reports. Just stay away." He hung up. I didn't press it. I didn't want to know. But I know what I saw. Barnaby was never the same after that night. He developed a fear of the dark, pacing the house at 2 a.m., staring at the floor vents, growling at sounds I couldn't hear. I eventually had to put him on anti-anxiety meds just so he could sleep. I think he saw what was coming up those stairs before I did. And sometimes, when it storms, I wake up to the sound of grinding metal, even though I live in the city now. And in my nightmares, I'm back at the top of the stairs, looking down into the dark, and a pale, mud-smeared hand is reaching out to pull the door shut, locking me in with whatever lives beneath the rock. I am an old man now, living out my days in a suburb that is too loud and too bright. But 30 years ago, I sought the silence. In the summer of 1993, I worked as a fire lookout in the Ouachita National Forest, a sprawling expanse of pine and shadow in Arkansas. It was a job for loners, for men who preferred the company of clouds to conversation. My post was Tower 4, a remote station accessible only by a 4-mile hike. My only link to the outside world was a shortwave radio and the nightly check-ins with the ranger at the base station, a man named Declan. I had never met Declan face to face. He was just a disembodied voice, a gravelly baritone that anchored me to reality. We developed a rhythm, a camaraderie born of static and solitude, until the night the fire appeared. It was a Tuesday, the air thick with humidity, the moon obscured by a heavy cloud deck. I was reading a paperback, the radio humming softly, when I saw it. A bright, orange flare erupted in the valley to the north, about a mile from my tower. It wasn't a gradual smoke plume, it was an instantaneous ignition, a perfect circle of flame appearing out of the darkness. I grabbed my binoculars. It was a bonfire, massive and roaring, built in a clearing that I knew for a fact was dense underbrush. There were no trails there, no campsites. Base, this is Tower 4, I radioed, my voice tight. I have a visual on an unauthorized barn. Grid Sector 7 Alpha, large blaze. I waited for the squawk of the return. Silence. Base, do you copy? Declan? Static hissed back. Then Declan's voice cut through, sounding distorted, weirdly breathless. Copy, Tower 4. I see it on the sensors. Go check it out. Report back. I frowned. Sensors? We didn't have remote sensors for visual fires. And standard protocol was to stay in the tower and guide a ground crew. Declan, protocol says I hold position. Should I? He cut me off. Just go, Arthur, now. The radio clicked dead. A cold unease settled in my gut. Declan sounded wrong, rushed, or maybe frightened. But the fire was growing, the flames licking at the canopy. I had no choice. I grabbed my pack, my heavy flashlight, and the handheld radio and descended the tower stairs into the suffocating dark of the woods. The hike was a nightmare. The forest felt hostile, the branches snatching at my uniform like skeletal fingers. I navigated by the glow of the fire through the trees, a beacon of destruction. As I got closer, the smell hit me, not wood smoke, but an acrid chemical stench, like burning plastic and hair. I slowed my pace, creeping through the final line of brush. I stepped into the clearing and froze. The fire was there, raging, but it was wrong. It was a perfect geometric pyramid of logs, stacked with impossible precision, burning with a silent, intense heat. And there was no one there. I circled the fire, my flashlight beam cutting the shadows. No footprints, no gear, no trash. Just this impossible fire in the middle of nowhere. Base? This is Arthur. I'm at the site. It's a decoy. There's nobody here. It's just wood. Silence. Declan! Then a sound came over the radio. Not a voice. Breathing. Heavy, wet breathing right against the microphone. Then a click. And then faintly, in the background of the transmission, I heard a door creak open. My door. The door to the tower I had just left. The blood in my veins turned to ice. The transmission wasn't coming from the base station. It was coming from my tower. Whoever was on the other end was using the main console. I was a mile away, alone in the dark, and someone was in my sanctuary. I killed my flashlight immediately, plunging myself into blindness. Panic clawed at my throat. It was a trap. The fire was bait to get me out of the tower. I stood in the darkness, trembling, listening to the roar of the fire and the pounding of my heart. I couldn't go back. If they were in the tower, they had the high ground. They could see everything. I had to make a choice: hide in the woods or run for the base station 4 miles down the mountain. I chose to run. I moved as fast as I dared without the light, stumbling over roots, guided only by memory and terror. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep behind me. I felt exposed, hunted, a soft animal in a world of teeth. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, the path twisting and turning, mocking my escape. I ran until I tasted copper in my throat. When the lights of the base station finally appeared through the trees, I nearly wept with relief. I burst into the clearing screaming Declan's name. The station cabin was dark, the windows staring blankly like hollow eyes. The front door was wide open, swinging gently in the night breeze. I slowed down, the adrenaline crashing into dread. "Declan?" I called out, my voice cracking. I drew my utility knife, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and stepped onto the porch. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of the electric meter. I walked inside. The station was empty, but it wasn't just empty, it was interrupted. Declan's coffee cup was on the desk, still warm, a faint wisp of steam rising from the black liquid. His chair was pushed back as if he had stood up in a hurry. The base radio microphone dangled by the cord, swaying slightly. And the radio was smashed. The faceplate was shattered, wires torn out, sparking intermittently. But that wasn't what stopped me. On the floor, leading from the desk to the open door, were drag marks. Deep scuffs in the linoleum, accompanied by long, bloody streaks where fingernails had tried to find purchase. They went out the door and vanished into the gravel of the driveway. I backed away, my mind shattering. I wasn't safe here. No one was safe here. I bolted for the main road, flagging down a passing logging truck a mile later. I was hysterical, rambling about fires and blood. The state police arrived an hour later. They swept the mountain. They found the fire. It was indeed a pyre of chemically treated railroad tires, stacked with machine-like precision. They went to my tower. It had been ransacked, maps shredded, glass broken, and my cot slashed to ribbons. But they never found Declan. There was no body, no trail beyond the driveway. The search dogs refused to go into the woods near the base station. They just whined and cowered. The official report listed him as a suspected runaway or a victim of a wandering predator. But I knew the truth. They never found the second radio, the one in my tower, the one I heard breathing on. The police said I must have imagined it, that stress caused auditory hallucinations. But I know what I heard, and I know why Declan told me to leave. He wasn't sending me to check a fire. He was trying to get me out. He was trading his life for mine, distracting whatever had come into his cabin so I would be out of the tower when it or they came for me. The fire was the lure, but not for me. It was the lure for the thing that took him. I never went back to the woods. I live in a city now, surrounded by concrete and people. But I still have a radio scanner. I listen to it late at night, searching the frequencies for something I hope I never find. Sometimes, on the dead channels, between the static and the white noise, I hear it. A click. A wet, labored breath. And then a voice that sounds like Declan, but distorted, stretched thin like taffy, whispering the same thing over and over. "Don't look at the fire, Arthur! Don't look at the fire!" I turn it off, but the voice lingers in the silence of my room, a ghost in the static, waiting for the day I decide to answer.